So we are continuing on in our narrative lectionary today, and in doing so, we're jumping a little bit further than we did last week. So the first week we were at Noah, we looked at the flood. Last week we were at the very beginning of the Abraham narrative. In fact, he wasn't even Abraham yet, he was Abram. And at the very beginning of his call to journey and to follow God. And we're actually going to jump ahead 4 generations now. So we had, last week we were at Abram. Abram eventually becomes Abraham. Abraham has 2 sons. One through a servant, Hagar, Ishmael. And then he has one with Sarah, Isaac. And from Isaac, who is then married, Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And what's interesting in these stories is that Isaac is technically the youngest son of Abraham. Ishmael is older, but Isaac receives the blessing. Generally, that blessing goes to the oldest son. Isaac receives the blessing from Abraham. And then there's Jacob and Esau, who are twins. But Jacob comes out second. On the text says on the heel of Esau. And Jacob and his mother conspire together to fool Isaac. And Jacob ends up with the blessing from Isaac. So we have the youngest son, again, getting that blessing. And now we are going to be looking at the story of Joseph. And Joseph is one of Jacob's 12 sons. And he is actually not quite the youngest. There's one younger than Joseph, but he is considered the favored son of Jacob. Joseph, some of you might remember, he gets the special coat, right? The Technicolor dream coat, and is just well loved by his father, and is not incredibly humble about that fact. In fact, he has a dream. We're not going to read that part today. We're going to be past that. So he has a dream. And in this dream, he sees all of his brothers bowing down to him. And he has no problem telling his brothers, you're going to bow down to me. And so his brothers get a little jealous, get a little mad. Joseph rubs some salt in the wound, and they conspire to kill Joseph. But Reuben, he at the last minute has a little change of heart and is like, let's not kill him, let's just throw him in a pit instead. So much better. So they throw Joseph in this pit, and they take his beloved coat that his father gave him, and they put some ram's blood on it, some sheep's blood on it, to try and fool Jacob into believing that Joseph is dead. But it ends up being that some Ishmaelites are passing by. So instead of leaving him in the pit, they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites and sell him into slavery. So he has been sold, and the brothers take the jacket to Jacob, and Jacob believes that his favorite son, Joseph, is dead. We are going to be picking up the story of Joseph after he is sold to the Ishmaelites. And then the Ishmaelites actually sell him to an Egyptian named Potiphar. And we're going to read all of chapter 39 today, which is Joseph's time in Potiphar's house. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything, but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was a handsome and good-looking man. And after a time, his master's wife cast his eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So this isn't our usual Joseph story. When we talk about Joseph, we talk sometimes about his brothers throwing him in the pit. Sometimes we talk about a little later down the road, Joseph still in prison but interpreting dreams, and eventually interpreting dreams for the Pharaoh himself. We talk about Joseph's rise to power, to being the second in command in Egypt, as he helps them prepare for a 7-year famine. We talk about later when Joseph is in power and his brothers have to come and beg for food, not knowing that it's Joseph. And we look sometimes at Joseph's trick in getting his brothers into some trouble over stealing something they didn't actually steal. And really, the Joseph narrative as a whole is meant to explain how it is that the Israelites ended up in slavery in Egypt. So, the Joseph narrative is all of chapter 37, all of 39, and then 40 through 50. So you're looking at about 12 chapters to explain how it is that Israelites ended up enslaved in Egypt. But throughout that, we have all of these episodes in Joseph's life where we can learn and grow and understand. And most of the time, we choose ones that paint Joseph in this really good light, which is really easy to do because Joseph is a man of integrity. He really is this kind of stand-up guy who does what is right. Here in this story, he is put in a terrible situation because of Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife is a woman of status. She is in power and control. She has the financial means. She is in every way better than he is by societal terms. And if he sleeps with her, it's very likely that maybe nobody will find out, and he can kind of have his cake and eat it too, as they say. He can be in charge of his master's household, he can have a beautiful woman, but he decides not to do that, and instead does what is right. And he in fact says to her, how could I sin against God? How could I give in to this wickedness in this way? And so he is adamant in telling her no, and in doing what is right. He's really a man of moral character and integrity. And so we can very easily choose these stories where Joseph can teach us this phenomenal lesson of being a good person and of how through no fault of his own he had this terrible life kind of happen to him. But I think we can push back on that a little bit too, okay? So Joseph knows he's the favorite child, right? He kind of rubs that in. He's not exactly humble about it. He tells his brothers, yeah, I got this coat and I'm dad's favorite, but you're about to bow to me too. And it upsets his brothers. And then here, with Potiphar's wife, we have kind of that same haughty attitude going on. In fact, he says to Potiphar's wife, your husband is no better than I am. We are equal in this household. Well, we find out quickly that's not true, right? So, I mean, maybe Joseph isn't entirely innocent in all that's happening. Maybe if he hadn't told his brothers they were going to bow to him, they wouldn't have tried to kill him or sell him into slavery. Maybe if he hadn't kind of antagonized Potiphar's wife, maybe she wouldn't have lied about the fact that he didn't sleep with her. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that it seems as if Joseph's story just kind of gets worse and worse and worse for a while, right? So first, he's going to be dead. And then he's sold into slavery, which continues his suffering. He isn't with his family. He's no longer a favored child who doesn't even have to go out and work with the sheep, but gets to stay home, comfy and cozy. Instead, he has a hard life of slavery. And he finds a way to work himself up in that position of slavery and becomes a very favored slave. And then it kind of gets worse again. He ends up in prison. So he went from semi-freedom out in the world at least, and being in charge and held responsible for a lot of great things in Potiphar's house, to now being imprisoned. And even in prison, he then is able to kind of do what is right and find favor in the eyes of the jailer and become in charge of things happening in prison. But over and over again, we see this kind of pattern of bad things happening to Joseph, right? It's the story of why do bad things happen to good people, right? We know that story over and over again. We see it in our own lives, that person who just can't ever seem to catch a break, or even though they're the best person, and we ask, why does this keep happening to them? Why can't they catch a break? Why does life throw everything at them when they're such a good person? And we see that over and over again. We ask that question over and over again. And I think we can ask it here of Joseph as well. Why does this keep happening to Joseph? Why can't Joseph catch a break? What is going on? And yet throughout all of this, there's one refrain that's repeated. It's repeated about 8 times in these 23 verses. And it is that the Lord was with Joseph. Over and over and over again, that's the refrain that is repeated here. The Lord was with Joseph. Yet Joseph is in pain. Joseph is separated from his family and his loved ones. Joseph is belittled and treated poorly. Even when Joseph does what is right in saying no to Potiphar's wife, he's punished. Something bad happens to him. This bad just happens over and over and over again. And the bad things that are happening happen because of people in power. Yes, they happen because Joseph is powerless, but they also happen because of people in power. Joseph's brothers have power over him. Power in number, power in stature, They are stronger than him. They are tougher than him. He is powerless to fight off 11 brothers. And so he's sold into slavery. His owners have power over him. He is a slave. If he were to try and run, if he were to misbehave in any way, they would have the right to beat him or kill him. With Potiphar's wife, he is powerless. She is in the position of power. Yes, she is female. However, she's Egyptian, of a wealthy family, and her husband is high up in the government. So she has power over him. And even here, it is shown very quickly how powerless he really is. His word against hers, and her word is automatically taken, because as she points out more than once, he is the foreign Hebrew who came to insult me. Over and over again, the people of power put Joseph in these situations of pain and suffering. Over and over again, the people of power put Joseph in situations where he can't possibly win. He says yes to Potiphar's wife. Maybe he gets caught and killed for sleeping with Potiphar's wife. He says no to Potiphar's wife, and he gets put in prison. Over and over again, the people in power make it so that Joseph doesn't have any good options. He is powerless, and the bad things keep happening to him. And yet, God is with him. There are two major schools of theology that we can look at when it comes to this text. So there's something called wisdom literature. In wisdom literature, it is the belief that blessings, good things, are from God, and they are rewards for you being a good person, and that bad things are punishments from God because you sinned in some way. Okay, so think about the story of Job. When Job's family is killed, his friends say to him, "What did you do to God? Like, what sin did you do to bring this about?" This idea, this way of thinking, we see it in society as well, right? There's always somebody when a hurricane happens that says this is God's judgment. Think after 9/11, how many people said this is God's judgment? Okay, it is the belief that bad things happen because God is punishing us. But here, in this Joseph text, we have bad things happening to Joseph over and over and over again, and yet the refrain is, God is with Joseph. The Lord is with Joseph. The Lord is with Joseph. The Lord made Joseph to prosper. So it kind of goes against that understanding. And instead, we have something called liberation theology, which is this understanding that God is with the poor, God is with the powerless, that while God does not stop the bad things from happening, God also does not make the bad things happen, but rather God is present in the bad things. God is there in the moments of powerlessness, in the moments of pain, and in the moments of suffering. That is what we see here in this Joseph story. And it might be what you've experienced in your own life as well. Perhaps a moment when you were at your worst, when you were in the most pain you've ever felt, when you were the scaredest you've ever been, is the moment you have most felt connected to God. Maybe you have lived this liberation theology. God liberated you from the fear and the pain and the struggles of that moment by being present with you. As we look at this story of Joseph, as we're reminded that God's presence is there, the Lord was with Joseph over and over and over again. We're reminded that God is with us in these moments of pain and suffering. And that sometimes all we have to do is look for God, to realize that God is there. That sometimes in the midst of pain and suffering, all we can see too much and too heavy to be able to look beyond it, to see God's presence. One of the reasons that I'm United Methodist, that I am a believer in John Wesley's theology, is because John Wesley believed that God does not make bad things happen, but that God gives you the grace to get through them. And that is the story of Joseph here. God didn't make these bad things happen to Joseph, nor did God take these bad things from Joseph. But God gave Joseph everything he needed to prosper even in the midst of the bad things. If we look at our culture and our society right now, we can say there are bad things happening. We can look at the pain and the suffering of the world. We can say that, our nation is going to HE double hockey sticks in a handbasket, right? But even in the midst of all of that, the Lord is present with us. And the Lord is going to give us the grace to prosper even in this bad stuff. Because the Lord is with us. In the good, in the bad, the Lord is with us. It is the refrain that always remains true. The word here is hesed in Hebrew, hesed. Steadfast. The Lord is steadfast with Joseph. The Lord is steadfast with us. Amen.